Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who also goes by RFK Jr., is an attorney who has dedicated the bulk of his career to protecting and restoring the environment. In April of 2023, he declared his candidacy for the Democratic presidential nomination. Later that year, in October, he switched to running as an independent candidate. He continued his campaign up until August of 2024, when he pulled out of the race and endorsed Donald Trump. Then, this past November, Trump announced that he would be nominating Kennedy to serve as Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services. And then this happened.
I have great concerns for someone who has shown complete disregard for public health.
RFK Jr. is incredibly controversial for a number of things that he has said about health, particularly the fact that he has questioned vaccines. He has said that vaccines lead to autism, something that there are no studies that back up.
Well, it seems to be that he fits with a pattern that we've seen this week, which is the hiring of people that are not just unqualified for a particular cabinet post, but unfit. Mr. Kennedy has already shown over the last 10 years his penchant for not just promoting unproven ideas, but promoting disproven ideas.
It goes without saying that a lot of people are not happy with the idea of RFK Jr. being in charge of the nation's healthcare. This is because he is a staunch vaccine skeptic.
I said not one of these 72 vaccines has ever been tested pre-licensing in a placebo-controlled trial where you're looking at vaccinated versus unvaccinated kids and looking for at health outcomes. Never been done. So nobody knows what the risk profile for these products are. So they're telling people they avert more harms than they cause. But there's no science behind that statement. It's just it's just a guesswork.
But today's video will not be about vaccines. Today, I'll be addressing Mr. Kennedy's comments about how toxic the American food supply is thanks to the overabundance of artificial dyes. Before we get into his comments though, I want to do a quick overview of the position that he has been nominated for. The HHS Secretary is one of 26 members of the Cabinet of the United States. The Cabinet consists of the Vice President, 15 executive department heads, and 10 cabinet-level officials. The Department of Health and Human Services is in charge of, and I quote, enhancing the health and well-being of all Americans. The HHS Secretary has 29 offices and operating divisions in their charge. Some of these are not well known, but most likely you've heard of these four: the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, the Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA, and the National Institutes of Health, aka the NIH. The Secretary of Health and Human Services is a very important position with a lot of responsibility. Now, when it comes to nutrition, Kennedy has not been shy about making his opinions known. He has even made comments about Trump's diet.
Traveling during that time with President Trump, and the stuff that he eats is really bad.
Now, let's take a look at this clip from Fox News to see what he has to say about artificial dyes.
You see your yellow food coloring, that is a petroleum product. Mm-hmm. It's associated with with depression. It's associated with autoimmune injuries and ADHD. Yeah. And red dye also is very bad. In Europe, the same companies are producing the same products, but they're using natural coloring. But here they can get away with it.
In this video, Mr. Kennedy talks mainly about the harms of yellow 5, aka tartrazine, and he claims that it has been associated with all of these conditions. So, is there any science to back up Mr. Kennedy's claims about artificial dyes? Well, it turns out that the answer is a little bit yes, but also a little bit no. Artificial food dyes have been linked to negative health outcomes, but not to the extent that Mr. Kennedy claims. Before I get into the science though, let's talk for a little bit about what artificial dyes even are. Artificial food dyes are chemicals that in the modern day are typically synthesized from petroleum. They exist to impart brilliant colors to foods and make them more attractive to consumers. Without artificial colors, a lot of packaged foods would look dull due to the loss of color that takes place during processing and storage. Humans have been dyeing foods for a very long time. In ancient times, people used minerals and plants to create dyes like lead oxide and turmeric. The first synthetic dye, mauve, was created by William Henry Perkin in 1856. In the 1900s, some merchants made the unfortunate choice of using dyes to hide the fact that their products were made of poor quality. Chemicals that we knew then and know now to be toxic, like lead and mercury, were commonly used. Fortunately, regulators stepped in. Congress passed the Food and Drugs Act in 1906 to protect the public from poisonous dyes and food that was colored to create the illusion of good quality. In 1938, we got the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which went beyond the scope of the Food and Drugs Act of 1906 to add more government supervision of food, drugs, cosmetics, and medical devices. 1960 saw the creation of the Color Additive Amendments, which outlined the conditions that must be met for a colorant to be considered safe for consumption. These amendments are of critical importance because they also included a clause about the potential for food dyes to cause cancer. The Delaney Clause states that a color additive shall be deemed unsafe if the additive is found to induce cancer when ingested by man or animal, or after other relevant exposure of man or animal to such additive. Right now, there are 7 different food, drug, and cosmetic dyes that have the FDA's approval. You've probably seen these on the labels of your snacks or drinks as F, D, and C dyes. These dyes are red number 3, red number 40, yellow number 5, yellow number 6, blue number 1, blue number 2, and green number 3. While it may seem like conversations about the safety of dyes are a relatively new phenomenon, the fact of the matter is that people have been asking these questions for decades. Dyes have even been banned in the past too, due to them being found to be unsafe. For example, Violet 1, which was used to stamp animal carcasses for meat inspection, was banned in 1973 after research suggested that it could cause cancer in animals. Now, let's get back to Mr. Kennedy's claims about the health outcomes linked to artificial dyes. Based on the small body of evidence available, I can say that there are 2 outcomes for which we have a significant amount of data, at least enough to say that there is a plausible link: hypersensitivity and hyperactivity, or ADHD. Let's start with hypersensitivity. There is data which links red 40, yellow 5, and yellow 6 to hypersensitivity or an exaggerated immune response in some people. Based on that evidence, I can say that there is some validity behind Mr. Kennedy's claim that dyes can cause autoimmune injuries or even asthma. However, I would have used different terminology. I think that a more accurate characterization of this link would be that certain dyes may trigger allergic reactions in some people. All right, let's do a quick review of the science, starting with red 40. In a study from 1978 of 52 patients, eliminating all dyes and potentially triggering additives and then adding red 40 back into the diet caused a hypersensitive reaction in 15% of patients. In the 1970s, multiple cases of sensitivity to yellow 5 were reported. Mostly the reactions consisted of asthma and hives. In 26% of people who already have some type of allergy, consuming 50 milligrams of yellow 5 resulted in allergic reactions, which include blurred vision, a feeling of suffocation, itchiness, hives, weakness, and heat wave. Studies also show that people who are sensitive to aspirin may also have issues tolerating yellow 5. The research also shows that even small doses of yellow 5 can trigger an allergic reaction in sensitive people. In one study, people with chronic hives and aspirin intolerance were given just 0.22 milligrams of yellow 5, much less than what you would get from a bag of candy, and it caused a reaction in 8% of people with hives and 20% of people with aspirin intolerance. Lastly, we have yellow 6. The earliest report of hypersensitivity to yellow 6 is from 1949. Yes, 1949. There have been several case reports of people who had a reaction to yellow 6 that was confirmed with skin prick tests and challenge tests, which is when scientists present a patient with something that may cause an adverse reaction in a relatively safe and controlled setting, and then they just observe what happens. I was able to find one clinical trial from 1973, the results of which suggest that yellow 6 could trigger hives and other allergy symptoms like red eyes and nasal congestion in people who already get recurrent hives. So yeah, that's pretty much the data that we have on hypersensitivity and dyes. Based on this, would I say that the evidence is robust that all of us need to be concerned about consuming yellow 5 and breaking out into hives? No, but I would say that this is enough for us to say, hey, we need to have larger, better designed studies to really look into this because there is a part of the population that could be affected by consuming dyes. Okay, now let's move on to the evidence on hyperactivity and ADHD. This is the outcome for which there is perhaps the most scientific scientific support, so I will give Mr. Kennedy points for this one as well. Back in the 1970s, medical doctor Benjamin Feingold first called attention to the potential for artificial colors to affect children's behavior and ability to learn with this landmark publication. By the way, hyperkinetic disorder is an old term for what we today refer to as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. What I find astonishing about this paper is that just as today we are having debates about whether or not ADHD is becoming more common, or if the increase in diagnoses just has to do with more awareness around the condition, people back in the 1970s were asking the same questions. It's cool to see how the past reflects the future, although it would be nice to actually get some answers to these questions. Anyway, in this review of the literature, which included a randomized controlled trial as well as a meta-analysis and systematic reviews, researchers concluded that diets restricting artificial colors can help with symptom severity in children with ADHD. The authors of this meta-analysis of multiple studies concluded that an estimated 8% of children with ADHD may have symptoms related to synthetic food colors, and that a restriction diet benefits some children with ADHD. So basically what the authors are saying is that there is evidence that a small fraction of children with ADHD can be affected by synthetic dyes, but more research is needed. This review of evidence from both human and animal studies, including 27 clinical trials conducted in children, supports that conclusion, while adding another interesting tidbit. The authors stated that current evidence from studies in humans, largely from controlled exposure studies in children, supports a relationship between food dye exposure and adverse behavioral outcomes in children, both with and without pre-existing behavioral disorders. What they're saying here is that even in children without ADHD, artificial food dyes can induce negative behavioral changes. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, how is it possible that food dyes can affect children's behavior? What are the mechanisms? As explained in this paper, synthetic food dyes may cause behavioral problems by affecting the capacity of your neurons, which are cells in your nervous system, to form connections and send information to one another, and by causing inflammation in the nervous system and causing neurons to break down. Basically, they can cause a communication breakdown between the cells of your body. And I may be being too generous here, but perhaps this is what Mr. Kennedy meant when neurological damage was listed here. That is just a potential mechanism for people with ADHD, though. It's not something that has been studied in the general population or in adults, so I don't think it's fair to list that separately. That's slipping into the realm of saying things not fully based on the science. Okay, so the scientific support for a connection between artificial dyes and ADHD is there. Based mainly on this fact, scientists have made the argument that the FDA needs to review the acceptable daily intake levels of artificial dyes. Part of the reason why we need more research too is because a lot of this data, as I said before, is old, in the 1940s, the 1970s, and so forth. Since then, we have learned so much about behavioral disorders, so we need studies designed with that updated knowledge in mind. It's also worth noting that behavioral conditions like ADHD can present very differently in different people. And with the large volume of dyes that are currently approved by the FDA, not to mention how ubiquitous they are, it would take a lot of effort to design studies to really understand the effects of every single one of these dyes in all types of people who have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder or some other type of related behavioral disorder. Another thing that makes these studies difficult is that foods that have artificial dyes also tend to come along with a lot of sugar. So that's something that we just are going to have to figure out. Maybe Mr. Kennedy can put money into funding studies like this. So we talked about hypersensitivity and hyperactivity. What about the other conditions that Mr. Kennedy mentioned? He also has tumors listed here as a potential side effect of consuming artificial dyes. There is evidence that artificial dyes can cause tumors, but it is important to note that this evidence comes from animal studies. Let's take a closer look. Red 3 was shown to increase the risk of thyroid tumors in male rats in these studies. Dyes can also be contaminated with cancer-causing substances. One example of such a chemical is benzidine. You can see on this CDC website that benzidine is known to cause cancer in people who are exposed to it for long periods of time. The Department of Health and Human Services, the World Health Organization, and the EPA all agree on this. Despite its status as a carcinogen, the FDA does allow small amounts of it in our food, specifically just 1 part per billion. Researchers have argued, though, that our food supply contains much more than just 1 part per billion of this carcinogen. It has been estimated that some foods may contain up to 80 parts per billion of this contaminant, which is way higher than the FDA limit. Now, continuing on with the rest of the claims that Mr. Kennedy made, there really is not enough evidence out there to support a strong causal relationship between these outcomes and the intake of artificial dyes. I searched for studies on yellow 5 and anxiety and depression, since that is a dye that he specifically talked about in the Enough is Enough video, but all I could find was a couple of studies that were done in rats. When it comes to hormone disruption, yellow 5 can affect levels of reproductive hormones. However, this is based on studies that were done on isolated cells or in rats, not in humans. Now on to his next claim, gene damage. In a review of the safety of tartrazine that was published just this year, you can find some evidence from in vitro or test tube studies that yellow 5 can cause damage at the DNA level. Tests using fruit flies and rodents show mixed results. High doses of tartrazine interrupted normal development for the fruit fly larvae and led to an increase in markers of oxidative stress in rats, something which could lead to DNA damage. These studies do not provide evidence that yellow 5 can cause DNA damage in living, breathing human beings though, as people generally do not consume the levels of yellow 5 that were used in these fruit fly and animal studies. Next up, we have his claim about intestinal injuries. Frankly, the evidence for this claim is weak. Taking all of the studies that have been done on yellow 5 as a whole, yellow 5 does appear to promote oxidative stress and inflammation. There were a couple of studies that revealed a potential link between yellow 5 and yellow 6 and intestinal cell damage. However, one was done in fish and the other in rodents. As for his claim about developmental delays, this is a bit of a stretch. There is evidence from studies in rats that tartrazine could promote oxidation in the brain and reduce the volume of some brain regions, but right now we don't have any data from human studies to show that dyes can cause developmental delays. So this pretty much summarizes what we know about artificial food dyes and their connection to our health. Okay, so at this point, you're probably asking yourself, if there's any evidence at all that these dyes can be harmful, why is the government allowing us to consume them at all? Does this mean that the USDA and the FDA are all corrupt? I, for one, don't think so. However, I do think that more research needs to be done on this topic and that regulators might just be lagging behind. The unfortunate truth though is that you cannot trust industries to just regulate themselves and test products to make sure that they're safe for human consumption without any oversight. Businesses are generally focused on making money, so we need government agencies to step in and make sure that their profits are being generated in an ethical manner. When regulators lag behind or are prevented from doing their jobs due to industry cover-ups, we end up with situations like the radium girls, the asbestos crisis, and the more recent opioid crisis. I'm going to go on a bit of a history tangent here, but stick with me, I promise it will be worth it. First, I want to talk about the example of the radium girls. In the early 1900s, female factory workers were hired to paint watch dials with a glowing paint which contained radium. Over time, several of these women became anemic and developed mouth lesions, tumors, and bone fractures, with some having their whole jaws break down and detach from their skulls. Many of these women died from radiation poisoning directly caused by the radium. However, their employers and even dentists and medical doctors and scientists who were well aware of the harms of radium hid this information from the women in order to keep the money flowing in. Now, fortunately, we have labor laws designed to protect workers who are exposed to occupational hazards. Now, let's talk about asbestos. If you're in your 30s or older, you likely remember seeing a commercial like this one on TV. These ads for mesothelioma became ubiquitous after we discovered that there was a connection between asbestos exposure and lung cancer. What's incredible though is that we didn't discover this connection in the 2000s or the 1990s or even the 1980s. Going back to the 1920s, there was already published medical research which showed that exposure to asbestos could cause a deadly lung disease. In the decades that followed, scientists and medical doctors continued to refine their understanding of the connection between asbestos and mesothelioma. Unfortunately, for the hundreds of thousands of workers employed at companies that procured, sold, and used asbestos in their manufacturing process, the industry became increasingly profitable in the same time frame, incentivizing companies to hide the health risks of asbestos from their employees. Leaders in the industry, including physicians, manipulated data, hid the results of medical tests from workers, colluded with insurance companies, and lobbied the UK government to limit industry safety inspections. Now, fortunately, we have laws that limit our exposure to asbestos. Now for my last example and the most recent one, the opioid crisis. Purdue Pharma carries the brunt of the blame for this crisis of addiction that has contributed to the deaths of over 640,000 people. example. They have been charged with lying to the DEA for a decade about how they were working to ensure that opioids were being prescribed only when medically necessary, and violating the federal anti-kickback statute by paying doctors to write more prescriptions for their opioid products, and by paying an electronic health record company to recommend and facilitate the ordering of their opioid products. Despite all the evidence, this is what Richard Sackler, former president of Purdue Pharma, had to say.
Sitting here today, after all you've come to learn as a witness, do you believe Purdue's conduct in marketing and promoting OxyContin in Kentucky caused any of the prescription drug addiction problems now plaguing the Commonwealth?
I don't believe so.
Nevertheless, all of this contributed to there now being better oversight of the prescription of opioids. Okay, that is it for my little history tangent. My point in bringing these up though is that we have been reminded time and time again throughout history that timely and effective regulation is absolutely necessary for public safety. While food dyes are likely not causing anyone to develop lung cancer or causing anyone's jaws to fall out, we need more research to really understand their effects on human health in the long term. We don't need studies that last 2 weeks or even 2 months. We need studies that last for years on end to see what continued exposure to these dyes throughout the lifespan could potentially do to us. This is something that is worth investing in because we all consume dyes from time to time. And that's because dyes are not just in the foods that you think they're in. They're even in the foods that you don't think they're in. And if you eat out at all, there's even more of a veil of mystery there, because I'm sure that you don't always check to see what the ingredients are in the drinks that you order at your favorite restaurant. Dyes are hidden in sneaky places in our food supply, and I'm gonna talk more about that right now. I'm gonna be going through different categories of foods that unexpectedly contain food dyes, and I'm also gonna give you an example from each category. Keep in mind that brands change their ingredients all the time, so the best way to know if something that you're buying actually contains an artificial food dye is to just make sure that you're reading the ingredients list. All right, let's go down the list. Number 1 is pickles. As an example, Mount Olive kosher dills contain yellow 5. Vlasic dill relish also contains yellow 5. Number 2 is pancake and waffle mixes. I found this Christie's pancake mix on Amazon that contained 4 different yellow dyes, but when I went to the Christie's website, I found that they updated the ingredients for pretty much all of their mixes to exclude artificial colors, which was really good to see. But there are still brands that include yellow dyes in their mixes. You just have to read the ingredients list. Number 3 is dried fruit. Dried fruit or dehydrated fruit is a better for you sweet snack option, but sometimes even these snacks may contain artificial colors, as you can see with this example. Number 4 is chips. Certain flavors of Pringles contain red and yellow dyes. Number 5 is jams and jellies. This Smucker's sugar-free strawberry preserves contains red 40. You can see it better if I scroll down here. Number 6 is boxed rice and pasta meals. When you think of lasagna, you probably think of an innocuous, quick dinner option. However, these pre-made dinners can contain artificial colors too. This one contains 5 different artificial dyes. Number 7 is pudding. Now, I know this isn't totally surprising because pudding is a highly processed food, so it's expected that it's going to contain artificial ingredients. However, I'm including this one because it's a great example of how colors can be deceiving. So here's an easy question for you. What color is chocolate? Brown, right? Well, this 0 flavor chocolate pudding from Jell-O contains red 40, yellow 5, and blue 2 to make that brown color. Now, something else that Mr. Kennedy mentioned in his interview with Fox News is that many companies have different ingredients for their European and American markets. This is actually true. One example of this is Skittles. When you look at the ingredients for Skittles sold in the US, you see a plethora of artificial colors. Red 40, yellow 5, blue 2, yellow 6, the usual suspects. Then, when you look at the UK version, you can see that the colors that they use are quite different. The colors are listed here as codes, but you can look them up and see that they're typically from natural sources. E162 is derived from beets. E163 is derived from a plant antioxidant. E170 is derived from a mineral that is found in eggshells. E160A is derived from a plant pigment that turns into vitamin A. E100 is derived from curcumin, which also has antioxidant properties. E132 is derived from indigo. And the last one, E133, is a synthetic dye. Now this begs the question, if these companies already have a way of making their products without the use of artificial dyes, why don't they just sell those products in the US too? Well, there are several reasons why, and you know what the number 1 reason is. It's money. Money is the reason. Artificial dyes are usually cheaper than their more natural counterparts. Also, they tend to impart brighter colors and hold up in products for a longer period of time. Another reason why companies deliberately include synthetic dyes in the American versions of their products is because the US government lets them get away with it. According to this article on the toxicology of food dyes, several major multinational companies have told the authors that they do not use dyes in Europe because governments have urged them not to, but that they would continue to use dyes in the United States until they were ordered not to or consumers demanded such foods. The laws which govern the permissibility of artificial food dyes in the United States place the burden of proof of safety on the FDA instead of on the companies that make these products with the artificial dyes. The result is that these companies can make demands of the FDA. Yes, they can make demands of their regulators. They can demand them to form advisory committees or even go to court. With the amount of roadblocks that companies can put up to create friction in the bureaucratic process of regulating them, it's not a surprise that the FDA continues to allow dyes in our food supply that may not be safe for everyone's consumption. So all in all, my final take is that skepticism is a reasonable position when it comes to assessing the safety of artificial food dyes. We barely have evidence from test tube studies and animal studies, let alone human studies, to really be sure that these dyes are safe for our consumption, especially in the long term. What's more is that we're taking this risk for very little return. The dyes impart no nutritional value. They're just there to make the food look unnaturally bright. While the safety of artificial food dyes remains up in the air, what we do have robust scientific evidence for is the consumption of real food. Fruits, vegetables, nuts, beans, fresh meat, those things. It just so happens that those foods also generally do not contain artificial colors. There are exceptions, of course, but generally whole foods are not going to contain artificial colors. So even if you're not that concerned about the potential harms of artificial dyes, if you care about your health at all, you should be making it a priority to consume mostly whole foods, primarily plants, if you want to have good health in the long run. By doing this, you'll be minimizing your intake of artificial dyes by default. If Mr. Kennedy does end up becoming the Secretary of HHS, he will be in a position to allocate funds to doing more research on synthetic dyes. That could end up being a good thing. It would take several years for us to see the results of these studies if they're done well, but I think it would still be worth it given how pervasive food dyes are in our food supply. Anyway, that is all for today. I hope that this dive into Mr. Kennedy's comments about artificial food dyes was helpful. If it was, please share the video everywhere that you can. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. Take care.